Hi, and welcome to another narration, presented by yours truly, Cryptids Roost. Be sure to check out the end screen, where you will find more videos listed. So grab your coffee, sit back and enjoy the show. And don't forget, where fear is, happiness is not. Halloween Collab 2022. This awesome Halloween collaboration is brought to you by various authors and narrators. Happy Halloween, everybody.
Drip, drip, drip. The consistent sound of liquid falling against concrete echoes throughout the room, while light pitter-patters of small black rats scampering across the floor momentarily distracts the shadow sitting in the corner. A small, disturbing smile creeps onto his lips upon hearing the cries of pain when the tip of his shoe sends the creatures in different directions. He has no intention of letting those vile and hungry things ruin his plans. He has waited far too long and worked way too hard for this moment to be different than what he has been imagining. Chains rattle further within the room as she stirs. Soft yet frightful whimpers quickly fill the room. Her head slightly rises, shakes from side to side as if she can't see the crumbling, slime-covered, damp walls surrounding her. Well, maybe she can't. At least not much with the blindfold partially covering her eyes. She whimpers ever so softly when his silhouette is outlined by the candelabra. Fear overwhelms the poor girl. Her heart begins to race as she attempts to free herself from the shackles. Her light blue eyes widen as the shadow gracefully moves toward her weak and semi-broken body. Light bounces off of the walls as he raises his hand, a large metal blade residing in his grip. I was beginning to think you weren't going to wake up, his rough voice growls. Where am I? She croaks. She grimaces from the dryness of her throat, causing her heart to thump wildly against her chest. The sinister man quickly becomes excited as he glides the blade across her left forearm. Tears roll down the side of her face. She refuses to scream, refuses to give in to this sick and twisted game. Hush, silly girl. Talking will only make you weaker, and I plan to keep you for quite some time. What do you want from me? I think you know the answer to that. But I don't even know who you are, she sobs. Oh, you'll figure it out soon enough, he chuckles. I've been watching you for a while now. Her chest starts to steadily rise and fall, her staggered breathing slowing as she tries to calm herself down. One can only imagine what thoughts are swirling around her mind at the moment. He calmly drags the blade across her chest, daring to further excite himself. He knows. Oh, he already knows that this will be his best work yet. This will be the most memorable muse he's ever had. Long, slender fingers glide through her shoulder-length, blood-soaked, chestnut-colored hair, while his face inches closer to hers. He inhales a deep breath and grins at the precise moment he pulls the satin fabric from her face. Her eyes widen upon seeing him so close to her. She must recognize him. She must finally understand what's happening at the particular moment, because she quickly tries to pull away, except those chains rattle with every ounce of strength she can muster up. Poor brittle girl. Instincts won't be able to help her. Nothing can. This can't be happening. Relationships aren't supposed to end up like this. You don't treat someone you love like this. She raises her voice. Why are you doing this, Josh? Well, maybe because I am going to love seeing that terrified look in your eyes when you realize no one can hear you. Did you honestly think I would have spent the past year and a half with you if I hadn't been planning something spectacular? Please let me go. You know I can't do that, Melody. He frowns. I won't tell anyone about this. I'll stay quiet. Just please let me go. She desperately pleads. Of course not. You are never getting out of here. alive anyway. The loud, high-pitched, and desperate screams vibrating her vocal cords could make anyone grind their teeth. Her beautiful porcelain skin, stained red, is gouged with the tip of his serrated blade. Blood rolls down her arm, forming a puddle just beneath her. His disturbing, amused cackle causes the hair on the back of her neck to stand up, goosebumps to crawl along her arms as he rips open her skin. Her screams only grow louder each time the blade slowly wiggles its way underneath the flesh. Every small puncture, every burning cut the blade makes sends adrenaline through her. However, she remains trapped in this nightmare. Seeing chunks of her skin being carefully torn off her petite, naked body is too much for her to handle. Her eyelids close and her jaw clenches, most likely from trying not to concentrate on the excruciating pain. Tissue, muscle, veins, and every other gory thing a human body has to offer presents itself to him, making his eyes widen. The glimmer residing within those deep green eyes is nothing other than sheer joy. Her screams have long since fell silent, yet his smile hasn't faded as he guides her right leg underneath the power saw. The sound of bone cracking ripples throughout the soundproof garage. The back of his left hand glides over his forehead, leaving a streak of crimson on it. He reaches above him, green eyes following the wire line just above his head, while he hangs another large piece of her. The vindictive, evil man picks up a pair of pliers, firmly grabs her detached ankle, and pries the toenails out of their rightful places. Cutting her into different sized pieces and hanging her flesh out to dry gives him the thrill of his life. He has spent nearly 2 years fantasizing about this exact moment, earning her trust, making her think that he loved her. Poor Melody. Poor, sweet, innocent, and dumb Melody. She ignored the signs, ignored his strange, obsessive behavior because deep down, she didn't believe he could do something so horrible. Small piece after small piece of her porcelain skin is tossed into a chest of ice. Thick strands of freshly washed chestnut-colored hair is neatly folded before being tucked into a Ziploc bag. Bloody nail clippings are neatly organized in a small leather box made from a previous victim, while the remaining parts of Melody are scattered across his workbench. Josh slowly pulls the dried out pieces of her down and begins to stretch them over the table he has already made, hand stitching the exquisite parts together. It won't take long for his masterpiece to be finished, and he's running out of time. Josh carries his fresh leather coffee table out of the garage, shutting out the lights behind him. He is exhausted from a days long of hard labor. His tired legs carry him through the small hallway of his house, fingers tightly clutching his newest piece of artwork. He places the table in the middle of his living room, just as sirens sound in the distance. What a shame it is to have such nosy neighbors. Too bad he couldn't have taken care of them first. He falls into the body-shaped groove of his couch, folding his arms over his chest while focusing his attention on the table just before him. They're getting closer. It's only a matter of time before those police officers bust through the doors. Melody's sweet screams rings in his ears, his eyes trailing along the handmade piece of furniture. She is the love of his life, his work life. Red and blue lights brightly flash outside of his windows. Rapid bangs sound on the front door while unfamiliar voices call out for him to surrender himself. Josh remains seated, allowing the officers to break down the leathery doors and enter his safe haven. They have been chasing him for a very long time, missing him by mere minutes wherever he has traveled to. Dozens of innocent women fell prey to his sickening needs. Josh has no intention to run this time. He wants everyone to see firsthand what he has created. Josh knows that he might spend a few years in prison. He knows that he will most likely be executed for what he's done, but to him, it was well worth it. A sinister, wild smile creeps onto his lips as satisfaction settles upon him. She truly was his best work. "Thank you, Melody," he whispers. Hello, my dream demons. That story was called Leather, and it happens to be one of my favorite things that I've written so far. I really do hope that you all enjoyed it just as much as I loved narrating it. Unfortunately, I do have a lot of things to get done in the Nightmare Realm, so I must bid you adieu for now. Please stay safe, and if you happen to have nightmares, that just means I've completed my task. Farewell for now.
The light below of a frigid wind had begun to settle in Valleywood, bringing the fall season in with it. What were originally plain green leaves were now replaced by the invigorating colors of red, orange, yellow, and brown. Every so often a leaf would glide down, landing gracefully with the wind as its only guide. It was October, and the valley was filled with the warm, welcoming faces of jack-o'-lanterns and folks who were enjoying the nice weather. The valley, although it was mostly a small place to live in, was always bustling during October and the Halloween season. Many kids would come down to the valley, old and young, as a place to hang out due to the lack of people. I was 18 at this time, and my job was going to be handing out candy from our spooky manor. My parents would often get some frightening material, some real and others corny. Our house was often the most decorated, and I remember as a kid I had always loved to go out and play pretend during the Halloween season. Just because our house would look like a ghost house, or a cemetery, or something of that sort. I was excited this year, just because it would be one of my first years giving out candy, and I would be able to scare the snot out of some little kids. All was going according to plan, except when my mother told me I had to go out trick-or-treating with Rachel, my little sister, this year. But Mom, I was going... Sweetie, you can't be arguing with me about some kid's holiday. Just go with Rachel for the night, and when you get back, you can do your little scare fest. Besides, you know how much she hates horror movies. She'll probably get too scared and want to go home. Although my mother's words were true, I still took them as a dart to my heart. Mostly because I was excited to scare the snot out of these kids. But I digressed and thought about how there was always next year. About a week before Halloween night, Rachel and I went out to go buy her a costume, and one for me to use to scare the kids. I chuckled when I went up to Rachel with my large bat head mask and tapped her shoulder saying, "Hey Rach, boo." Of course she jumped and then realized it was me, pouting and yelling about how it wasn't funny. To me, it was hysterical. I went off to the scare section to see what I could find. There are a lot of the oldies, Grim Reaper, Frankenstein, Hanging Man, all that junk. Nothing really popped out at me, so I decided to just grab a zombie makeup kit and leave it at that. Walking towards Rachel, I was happy to see she had picked out a Tinkerbell costume and was wearing its tiara. I walked over and smiled. Well, Tinkerbell is going with a zombie to get candy this year, huh? At first, she was a bit shocked and jumped, thinking something scary was behind her, but then she saw my face and immediately began grinning. "Big brother, I want you to meet somebody. He helped me pick between Cinderella and Tinkerbell," she exclaimed, face full of excitement. Rachel pointed me to a boy about her size and age who was hunkered over looking at many different princess and fairy costumes. I was trying to hold in all my laughter, seeing the boy rummaging through the fairy wands and tiaras. That was until I actually got to see what he looked like. "Hey, I want you to meet my brother," Rachel said, tugging on the boy's black, white, and gray striped jacket. The boy turned around to first stare at Rachel, but then moved on to me. All the laughter that I had held in was now replaced by curiosity on the boy's mask. He was wearing a dome-shaped mask that covered all of his face besides his thick brown hair. He had a hood on which concealed most of his hair, and I remember his jeans being very dark. But the most eerie feature about him was the mask. It was a mirror, and not like the chrome masks you see at Party City, but an actual mirror material. There was no expression to it, no lines except a few scratches that would cover the mask, and the only thing I could see was my shocked face staring back at itself. I realized how rude I was actually being, and I put my hand out smiling. "Hi there, I like your mask. Is that a real mirror?" The boy just seemed to look at my hand with his mirror mask and slowly nodded, not uttering a word. His silence seemed quite odd. I suspected him to be a mute, but then again, he just might have been shy about meeting me. "Okay, come on, Rach. We gotta get going. Mom is making spaghetti for dinner." "Aw, okay. Bye. I hope I see you on Halloween." The boy nodded at Rachel, continuing to stare at me though, my face reflecting in his mask. As we were leaving, I glanced back at him to see him rummaging through the princess costumes again, not bothering a soul. The week went by rather quickly. Rachel often complained about having to go to school on Halloween, and myself complained about having to watch Rach for the night. My mother told me that the zombie makeup would give Rachel nightmares, and so I had to go dressed up as nothing. This made me furious, but I decided it was too early to scare kids anyways, and that when Rachel went to bed, I could get ready. She went down in her Tinkerbell costume, giddy to go outside. My mother kissed her on the cheek, then looked at me sternly. "Be good. Don't scare Rachel. Understand?" I nodded, Rachel holding onto my hand in an attempt to drag me out the door. We walked down a few blocks, Rachel's bag growing bigger and bigger until I noticed a group of teenage boys riding their bikes our way. Of course, I can only assume they were boys, being that each of them were masked in a creepy costume, such as Freddy Krueger or Chucky. One kid had a mask that just plain disturbed me. A mask of a man whose face was completely disfigured by barbed wire and whose eyes were gouged out. Rachel began to squeak nervously when they were approaching us, but I told her they would not bother us if I was there. I must have forgotten how rude teens could be because they came straight up to us, the two in the back snickering as the ringleader made Rachel scream with a loud boo. "Look, fellas, the baby is crying." The boy laughed, followed by his goons. I was really irritated by this and looked at them sternly. "Knock it off." This was countered by some rousing ohs and laughter. The ringleader snickered and looked at me with his grotesque mask. "Why don't you just make us then?" At this, I smiled and drove my fist into the kid's stomach. He fell off the bike coughing a bit, then got up angrier. "Oh, you're in for it now, you little shit." Suddenly, the two boys in the back were on my sides, holding me down to the ground. I struggled to break free, but their weight surpassed what I could outdo. Rachel was crying, and the leader of the group began to kick my stomach in multiple times. "How's it feel, bitch?" the kid yelled as he kept kicking my stomach in my face. Rachel tried to muster up all of her courage to hit the attacker with her fairy wand, but in retaliation, he kicked her away. Not satisfied with my little to nothing reactions, his attention was focused onto Rachel. "Aw, a little princess thinks she can do shit. Ha!" I watched in terror as he advanced towards the cowering Rachel, picking her up as if to hit her. "Get away from her!" I screamed, only to be punched by one of his cronies. Suddenly, the brute dropped Rachel and began to let out a bellowing screech. I sat wide-eyed as the leader screamed louder than anything I had ever heard, holding his face shaking like a dog. The cronies released me to see what was wrong with him, as I took my chance to dash towards the crying Rachel. Picking up Rachel, I glanced back to see the leader tearing off his mask, screaming and begging for whatever force was harming him to stop. My eyes widened in terror as the boy began to tear out his eyeballs, screaming and begging for forgiveness. The other kids had run at this point. I could see their bikes riding off in the distance. I heard the disgusting sound of his eyes being torn out, blood pouring from the now empty holes. The bullish kid fell to the ground unconscious, and perhaps even dead. I ran as fast as I could, carrying Rachel, who was crying and whimpering the whole way. I thought that I could keep going. I would lose the image that was still fresh in my head. Then, Rachel began to scream. At first, it was just loud whimpering, but it advanced to the same octave as the kid from before. She screamed loudly. The only word she could utter was either mommy or my name. I was scared. I looked at her eyes to see what she was looking at, but it was not needed because she began pointing in the direction we were fleeing from. I turned quickly, expecting to see the eyeless bully following me. What I saw was the mirror boy from the costume store. He advanced slowly, almost shuffling towards us. The mirror seemed to be tainted, blotched blood spots around it. He was dragging something, but I couldn't take my gaze away from his mask yet again. I saw it then, what was making Rachel scream undoubtedly. Looking into the boy's mask instead of seeing my face reflecting back at me, I saw the face of Rachel. However, it was not the Rachel I knew. His face was horribly disfigured. Parts of her flesh were torn off, others hanging. Her eyes. God, her eyes. They were hanging out of her sockets, bleeding thick, blotchy blood. Her mouth was agape, tongue waggling out as if were a baby's rattle being tossed about. Her hair was matted and fried. Some of it was falling out to show off balding areas in her head. I gagged, holding in whatever would come out from seeing such a horrific sight. The disfigured face was advancing towards us with great haste. I started to scream, unable to move, holding onto what was the real Rachel, who was crying into my shoulder. The boy, no, the thing was advancing towards us, shuffling in his tracks. I ran again, only to trip and fall, holding Rachel tightly in my chest. The boy finally shuffled into my gaze, the mirror glittering against the moonlight. I winced, ready for the worst, holding Rachel tightly. Nothing had happened for a long time, and then I opened my eyes again to see what the boy was doing. I blinked to see a black glove holding a pretty tiara towards my face. The mask was no longer the horrifying image of Rachel, but instead was my teary face staring back. The boy held the tiara towards me, not speaking, not moving, and only tilted his head as if to wonder why it was taking so long. My shaking hand gripped the tiara as I pulled it out of his grip. He nodded at me and began to shuffle away from us, dragging something in his hand. At first, I was bewildered by what just happened, and I turned to look at Rachel, who had cried herself asleep to escape the nightmares that were alive that night. I turned back to face the boy, and I then noticed what he was dragging with him and almost gagged again. In his hand was the barbed wire and distorted face of the bully. Its eyes were gouged out, and the only thing that was different from the mask was how lifelike the dismembered head was. I took Rachel home that night, ignoring my mom's welcome homes and questions about why Rachel was sleeping and why I looked so pale. I tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and wished her a good night's sleep. I dragged myself to the restroom to piss away what wasn't already on my pants. Upon entering, though, I screamed louder than I ever could have done before. I saw him, gazing at me expressionless in the mirror. He was holding Rachel's head, the horribly disfigured one, and with a bloodied glove he began to write me a message on my mirror. I read carefully and was terrified to read the message. "Sweet dreams, princess." I broke off the towel rack and slammed it into my mirror, breaking it into many different shards. I blacked out, only hearing my mom's worried shrieks before I drifted into sleep. I can't look at mirrors anymore. I am always reminded of that horrifying image that keeps coming back in my head. I keep seeing the boy, holding a different head each time. Sometimes it's Rachel, other times my mother. Once I saw the face of my girlfriend, a year before I met her. The doctor calls it spectrophobia, the fear of mirrors. But I know that is not what it was. I know because every Halloween night, I receive a package with a hand mirror and a tiara taped onto it.
Well, the title says it all. I am a member of the Green Berets, the US's most prestigious warriors they have ever bred. This journey I am about to tell you all started during the coronavirus outbreak. Now, if you have ever heard of David Paulides and the missing 411, then you'll get an idea of what I will be discussing shortly. It began with a briefing from our superiors on our mission. There had been a surge of missing person cases in this particular national park before COVID hit. I won't say what park, but just know it was somewhere with much mountain terrain. This story will be told from my viewpoint and my partner, Nikolai. Briefing. SSG. Alright everyone, sit down and listen up. We have been asked for our assistance in surveying this park by the National Park and the White House. To keep it simple, we are tasked with discovering and eliminating whatever it is that is taking people from this park. The base has been set up and we have been asked to back up the FBI and their squads. We were told 2 of their squads were killed overnight and military involvement has been requested by the President. This mission is top secret and as you know, nobody is to know of this. We have been so generously given everything we need to complete this mission. The National Park and the surrounding areas have been closed off to the public, but this shouldn't be an issue due to the stay-at-home order set in place. This goes for all national parks. You are but one of many special forces tasked to eliminate this threat and has been deemed a national security concern by the White House. We have been given radar and will have air support on standby, as well as a blackbird in the air to keep an eye on your mission. You will be given 50 cals, armoured 4x4 Humvees, maps, live communication, thermal and night vision, and the best weaponry the United States military has to offer. Luckily we were given intel from the indigenous tribe that borders the park. Your bullets have been dipped in ash and whatever poor creature or beings that we may encounter will experience the full force that the United States military has to offer. That being said, you have 24 hours to get ready for your mission. Any questions? No response. Good. Day 1. As morning dawned, I made a cup of coffee, got my gear on and proceeded to the meeting point on the base. We began our trip in our armoured 4x4 Humvees and proceeded to the HQ base deep in the woods, which took the whole day. We took the forest road as dusk was approaching night. Alright men, keep a lookout, primarily on the tree line. As we drove, all was normal when suddenly we saw a pair of yellow eyes beginning to follow along with our platoon. "Don't worry, it's only a scout, but stay frosty." After a mile or so, we were in the clear. "Don't worry, they won't attack unless the eyes are red," said Nikolai. That was nice, I guess. We then approached the gates to HQ as we entered the range of light that the fog lights emitted. Once inside the base, we got out and proceeded inside. Now, I have been on military bases before, but this was pretty new. The base was filled with these fog lights and barbed wire fencing to keep anything outside the base out, not to mention the towers with thermal heat sensing 50 cals, as well as multiple MPs guarding the inside. The security for this base was something I would expect in the Middle East, not in the middle of the woods in the United States. Once inside the building, we were ordered to get our gear ready for an escorted patrol into the woods to investigate a cabin that a squad of FBI agents searched. We were called in for backup. Once we approached the cabin, we pulled security outside of it. Nikolai and I drew our rifles and our squad mate Roger broke the door down. We swept the cabin and saw one FBI agent cowering in the corner while this long skinny creature was feasting on the other now deceased FBI agent. Next thing I know, Nikolai blew that thing's head off with his shotgun. After we swept each room and deemed the cabin clear, we brought the surviving agent back to base. When questioned, the agent said, "We proceeded to enter the cabin and we heard some movement in one of the rooms. And as we approached it, the door swung open and that creature killed my whole squad. I thought I was a goner when it approached me and it spoke. I'll let you watch as I feast until you are the last, son of Yahweh. Your fear will make you a delicious meal." It kept smiling as it spoke and I just broke down. That's when you guys came in. "And the missing boy?" my SSG asked him. "I'm afraid we were too late. He was already dead when we arrived." Day 2. Another mission we were sent on was to investigate a summit where a ranger reported that on an overnight hike his tent was approached by multiple faceless men and they screamed such horrid noises he was paralysed with fear and had to be airlifted the following morning. Apparently the rangers had a rise of missing person cases around this summit. So we set up a fake camp and used the same ranger as bait. He was scared but felt better with the fact that he had backup from us. We set up snipers and the rest of my squad surrounded the tent from a good distance, activating night vision. Around 1 AM we saw movement. About 5 of those faceless men approached the tent and began to yell those noises. Then we fired. Snipers first, then the rest of my squad moved in. Those things tried to run off, but were met with the full force of my platoon. Safe to say, none of them got out of there alive. Our radio went off. "Stay put outside, the agency approaching to collect the bodies." Now my platoon was basically there to eliminate the threat. But as far as this outside agency, we had no clue who they were, nor what branch of government they belonged to. All I know is they picked up the bodies and the men in black spoke with my SSG as well as the commander back at HQ. Then they left. "Who the hell are those guys?" I said to Nikolai. "No idea, but it's best we don't ask questions," replied Nikolai. I'll say this, as our missions became more disturbing, I found it very hard to do just my job without knowing the full details. But nonetheless, I'm a soldier and I have a job to do, which I intend to do. Our next mission. Now, this was one of the worst missions I was a part of. We drove our Humvees to investigate reports of mutilated deer surrounding a lake that was popular during the park's normal hours when the park was open to the public. Once we arrived, the weather began to get worse, and then we noticed the red colour the lake began to give off. Then the strange cloud arrived. A crimson red just hovered over the lake. For some reason, Roger began to become hysterical and losing his damn mind, and then shot his 50 cal at the cloud, screaming, "No! You won't take me!" And then right after he shot, He was pulled into the cloud, and then the weather got so bad we couldn't even see. As soon as it started, he stopped, with Roger simply gone. We did not know what to do, so we reported what happened, and HQ reported back. Leave the area, now! Understood, replied our SSG. We then returned with a full force with air support. We found Roger's body dismembered and decapitated, floating in the lake. Also, those same unnamed agents came back to pick up his body parts from the lake and again were speaking to my chain of command. After this loss of my close brother-in-arms, I couldn't take it anymore. When the agent was speaking to my commander, I walked in to demand answers. I knew I would be in trouble, but I interrupted the meeting anyway, and after arguing with my commander to know what was going on, the leader of said agency broke the arguing. "It's fine, Commander. This one here is one of your top soldiers, so we can let him know," said the agent. "Well, son, I can only say so much, but what I can tell you is this. You are basically the first wave of forces to investigate these strange occurrences in the park. Then when the situation is deemed too great, that's where we come in," I replied. "Okay, so if we can't fight off some evil weather entity, how the hell can you guys stop it?" "Oh, we are aware of this. Normally your weapons are perfect to deal with cryptids, but this is beyond those insignificant creatures. We have weapons to not exactly destroy, but halt those sentient weather beings who are controlled by what we believe are extraterrestrials. The natives speak of these events and gods who control the weather, and their way of halting it was blood sacrifices. But when I say extraterrestrials, I'm not talking about little green men. No, these are extra-dimensional beings. They can come into this reality, in and out as they please. Our mission is to stop this with the military's help, of course. Together, we hope to curb this." "So what do these ETs want?" I replied. "We don't exactly know. We have captured some, and at first they couldn't be contained until we had a group of physicists create a room that does not allow these beings to escape," responded the agent. "These ETs tell us one thing, but we can't believe that they are not 100% honest. They see us in the same way we see animals in a zoo. One way we reduce these instances is to allow them to abduct people." "Wait, so you're fine with innocent people being abducted? Why on earth would you be okay with this?" I stated. "That's enough, soldier," my commander interrupted. The agent put up his hand in a stop motion. "It's fine, Commander. Look here, as far as we know, this is the best outcome until we can figure out a way to stop them. As of now, they are uncontrollable. We will close the parks until it is deemed somewhat safe for the public. But don't be surprised if you hear of missing person cases. Now I assume I don't have to worry about you speaking of this, right?" "Not like anyone would believe me. Don't worry about me. I simply wanted to know the entirety of my mission," I replied. The agent then stated, "That's something I expected from a decorated soldier such as yourself. Now, Commander, please escort your soldier out. I believe he deserves some relaxation after the hell he has experienced." Before leaving, I managed to find a folder in the safe that contained more information than what was given to me. Apparently, we found something in a cave from a mission Nikolai was on before this recent one. That mission was in Yosemite National Park. After confronting Nikolai about this, he told me we should talk in a more private setting and told me to leave my phone and anything trackable. We drove to a parking lot by a local bar a few miles from base. This base was the one we arrived in, not the one in the forest, for clarity's sake. "So this is what happened," said Nikolai. "I and my fellow squad were sent to investigate a cave. We got into a huge firefight and 3/4 of my squad was killed trying to capture one of these interdimensional beings. Apparently, when they're in their physical form, there is a slight window of opportunity where you can damage them. We managed to knock it out and locked it in a room that apparently the ET could not escape. Don't ask me how it works, I'm not a physicist, though it was thanks to a Russian physicist that designed the room. It basically said that the cave was one of many that connect together to the mother cave. It refers to itself as a fallen angel, and that the rest of its kind, along with its king, will escape when the earth cracks, releasing them. I don't know about you guys, but that sounds like the book of Revelations to me. It even said that the time will come in the same year that a great plague would cripple the world, which would start in China. Then just as this ET predicted, our military confirmed large heat signatures underground. The plan was to detonate a nuke. However, the problem was it was directly under Yellowstone National Park. Now these beings apparently lie, and this was indeed a lie because we mistook the heat signatures and they were indeed indicating magma activity. Individual heat signatures were found in Alaska. One of our scouting squads confirmed this when they found the mother cave and sent out an RC out with a camera. And to our horror, we saw more of these creatures that would make a Wendigo look like a puppy. The military plans on sending a large force to make some noise, but even then I don't know how the US alone will fare up against these things. So now, here I am writing this out. People need to realise what is going on in these parks. The government and military have no control over these events. It's best you stay away from the forest. I was granted leave for a few weeks, and when I returned I was tasked with leading a squad for the next mission. I am currently waiting for a flight to Alaska. Apparently, the Russians experienced the same phenomena in Siberia and followed the cave system to Alaska. The United States and Russia are teaming up after finding something that will shake our beliefs even further. Until then, it's best you stay home, for the virus isn't the only thing to keep you out of these woods.
Wouldn't be staying here if I was you, mister, the old man said. I looked at him curiously. His face was strange. Why not? I asked. Is there danger? The old man spat over his beer. Some said so, he said. The danger of what? I pressed. I didn't know you had wild animals in this place. The old man sighed. Depends on what you call animals, he said softly. Bars now, and catamounts, why, they're all gone long ago. Claim Hoxie shot last year more than 20 years back. But nobody ain't never shot one in this here canyon, mister. I don't recall nobody ever tried. Best humor him, I mused. I heard that lunatics were violent if you crossed them. Aren't you afraid to stay here then? I suggested. The old man grimaced at his long shadow on the grass. The sun's still up, mister, he said. Long as it's light, there's no safer place in these mountains than Dead Man's Canyon. It's only after dark that they come out. Some say the sun hurts their eyes, but I say it's holy writ that they only got powers in the night. The pestilence that walketh in darkness, mister. That's what the writ says. And anyhow, they don't never come out. That's why no one knows what they look like. I lit a cigarette. The trembling of my hands annoyed me. Altitude, of course. I wasn't being taken in by this old nut with his wild story. If you don't know what these things look like, I sought to reason with him. How do you know they're here? The old man spat. How did I know the moon's over there beyond them hills? His voice in tone. I can't see it, can I? But I know it's there. It'll come up when the sun goes down, and they'll come out. They'll come out like the day that night Roy Timmons got lost here. We found Roy in the morning, what there was left of him, over on that slab over yonder. Look at the slab. It was huge and dark, with a vague suggestion of having been quarried. An altar that was what it looked like, some sort of prehistoric stone altar, set against the background of the towering trees on the slope. Then there was little Sue, the old man went on. We never dared let Sue's mother know what shape we found her in. We buried her over there under the trees. Told everybody we hadn't located her. We never let Sue's mother know what shape we found her in. We buried her over there under the trees. Told everybody we hadn't located her. Mother still believing that the kid will come back home. Sometimes, to see her sitting there and hoping, why, I just break your heart, mister. But she mustn't ever know. I look apprehensively at the sun. It was very near the horizon. 6 o'clock it must be, I decided. Or perhaps near 7. But the month was July. The days will be very long. Oh, they're in here all right, the old man droned on. Why, we've seen their footprints lots of times. The funniest footprints, like a little baby's. And Mike Collins, him that has that farm over there on the hill. He's heard them hollering and carrying on in the night. I've seen lights flicker around the slab until dawn sometimes. He had a couple of big dogs, and he sickened them into the canyon to see if they catch anything. But the dogs never come back, and Mike never found no trace of neither one. His voice trailed off. Getting along towards sundown, mister. He began again after a pause. Don't you reckon you better be heading towards town? Will you? I press. I had some vague idea of getting him to an alienness. I can't stay here alone. You better come with me. We'll be safer together, you know? The old man chuckled sadly. Don't do no worrying about me, mister, he said. I'm nearly always here. Come sundown, of course, I head here for the road down yonder. I got to wait until the last minute, though. Maybe you ain't the only feller that'll come through here. I said, I mean you stay here every day to warn people off? You're sort of a sentinel? The old man nodded. Me and old Sam Timmons changes off, he told me. Sam was Roy Timmons' dad. First we tried putting up signs, but they took him down. Maybe they can't read or writing, mister. But they must have known somehow what them signs said. So now we just stay here ourselves. They can do us no harm, except sometimes they shuck a few rocks long about sundown. He broke off. A stone weighing into the tree grazed off and fell into a bush. I looked about for the thrower. There was nothing inside except the green wall of underbrush. See that, mister? That old man tut. That means they are mad. He raised his gun and fired both barrels into the air. Strange shakers awoke in the still air. That'll stop them, he said proudly. They don't like guns and shooting. It scares them, of course. They're extra bold now, because it's getting along towards the time of the full moon. Then they'll come out to dance around the old slab, and you'll see their lights flickering and hear him holler until near dawn. But, mister, you better be getting out of here while there's time. Don't worry none about the old man. Some damn boys from town of Lost come to fetch me if I don't show up right on time. I left him reloading his gun. He was staring into the deepening shadows on the canyon wall, and his face was drawn and pale. If only I could get one good shot at him, I heard him mutter. The journey was longer than I had thought it. The pathway was steep and ill-defined. The underbrush caught on my boots. I hurried along as fast as I dare. My imagination was busy with every rustle and crack of breaking twigs. As the shadow lengthened, I became sure that something followed me unseen. I was running and panting for breath. As I came out onto the welcome asphalt of the road that led to town, I rested there for a moment before going on. thankful for the glare of lights and the familiar sound of rushing motors. As I did so, one of the cars drew abreast of me and halted. "See anything of there, old fella with a gun?" his driver queried. Made out 3 other men in the vehicle. "Yes," I said slowly. "I did." "Back there in the canyon, I bet," the driver said. "That's where we pick him up every night, it's nearly. Did he warn you about anything, mister?" "He did," I admitted. "That's old Collins' witness." The driver nodded. "I reckon it's only natural since his granddaughter got killed there only last year. I reckon he got to putting 2 and 2 together with old Timmons, and they figure out this day business. They're both harmless enough, though, as long as we let them guard their canyon." "Then there's nothing dangerous in there?" I asked slowly. "Dangerous? Why, mister? What could be there? This here a civilized country, ain't it?" Driver slid his car into gear. "Well, good night, sir. We got to get their old feller down. Good night." It wasn't until some time later that I began to wonder why every man in that car should have been carrying a rifle, or why their faces were white and set, as the old man's face had been. Then one day I read in a newspaper about a certain Samuel B. Timmons, age 87, who had been crushed by a falling boulder and unrecognizably mangled. It was an accident, of course, so the paper said. That man's canyon's still there, if anyone cares to make a further investigation for my part.
I used to drive for Uber on weekend nights in a well-populated city. I had a job as a server at a cafe in the mornings, and I didn't really sleep much anyways, so I decided to work for Uber for some extra cash. The Monday was great, and most of my passengers were all extremely kind, so I really enjoyed my job. Driving on the weekends, I'd pick up some drunk partygoers, but those drives away ended up with funny stories. Things were going great until the night I picked up this couple. This happened a couple years ago, but I still can remember every detail of that night. I can close my eyes and be instantly teleported back to that moment. It was a little past 1:30 a.m. The relaxing beats from a lo-fi song were playing in the background as I cruised around some of the populated bar areas. I took a deep breath, taking in the smell of the citrus air freshener I had in my car. It was a pretty slow night, so I decided to call it and make my way back home until I glanced at my phone to see there was a ride close by. The rider's destination was on the way to my house anyway, so I decided to take it. I left the busy strip and drove towards the empty street a few blocks away. Standing against the stop was a man with medium brown hair wearing a blue button-down shirt and khaki pants. Standing behind him was a woman with long red hair with streaks of blonde. She was wearing jeans and some band shirt. When I drove up to them, I rolled down my window and called out the name that was on my phone. "Dave?" Dave flashed me a perfect white smile and said, "Yeah, you got me." I unlocked the car while I confirmed the route to take from here, the car shifting a bit as they climbed into the back seat. I glanced into the rearview mirror to get a closer look at them. Dave looked back at me with a big grin, and the girl just stared off through the window. Upon closer inspection, I saw that the girl's hair was a bit tousled and her thin round glasses were a bit crooked on her small face. "Everything all right tonight?" I asked. Dave continued to stare at me through the rearview mirror and answered, "Oh, yeah. Everything is great. Just leaving a date." Oh yeah? How'd the date go? I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. I was hoping for the girl to react, but she continued to look out the window as Dave answered me. Yeah, it was awesome. It was a Tinder date, so we did the usual, drinks here and dinner there. That threw me off. Where I picked them up was far from any bar or restaurant. I couldn't help but ask, what were you doing all the way over here? Dave paused a moment, never breaking eye contact with me from the mirror. We took a walk after dinner to get some steps in, you know? I'm not sure why, but looking at the girl gave me the sense of unease. I was worried because she didn't look good, and something about Dave was weirding me out. I asked if they were okay and if they needed anything, but Dave assured me that things were fine. The girl didn't react, so maybe I was overthinking things. I continued to drive. It was only about 20 minutes, but the awkward silence made it feel like an eternity. Then we finally approached an area I was familiar with after dropping off some people at some nearby apartments. Hey, you can just drop me off here. Dave spoke suddenly. We were in the middle of the street and a few blocks away from where he set his destination. Are you sure? I asked. Yeah, just need to stretch my legs. He opened the door and I looked to see that he had given me a great tip along with a 5-star review. I chuckled to myself as I thought about how weird he was. I heard the car door shut, and at that I was ready to go home. I drove for a moment until I heard something right behind me. It was the sound of a woman sobbing. My eyes shot back to the rearview mirror, and sure enough, that girl was still sitting in the back seat, tears rolling down her cheeks. She looked out the window. I slammed on my brake and let out a few choice words in my shock at seeing her. What the hell was that girl doing in my car? I took a moment to catch my breath, and I calmly looked at her reflection and asked, Ma'am, is everything okay? Why didn't you leave with your boyfriend? She finally began to move, her head turned towards my direction. That wasn't my boyfriend. She shouted out so suddenly that it made my heart bang against my chest. I can't go with him. Please, just take me home. I looked at her and I noticed black streaks forming down her face from tears and makeup. The woman's red lipstick was smeared at the corner of her lips, and the left lens of her glasses was slightly cracked. Christ! I yelled. Did that man hurt you? She sat there and stared back at me and placed her hand on my shoulder. Please take me home, she whispered under her breath. I didn't want to press the matter any further. I didn't know what was going on, and I'm just a damn Uber driver. I felt her hand shake on my shoulder. She was freezing cold. I let out a sigh and asked her where she lived. She took her hands off my shoulder and told me her address. Her house was in the completely opposite direction, about 40 minutes away. Great. I told her not to worry about pain. She had already had a bad night, and I didn't want to pour salt on the wounds with the ride fare. So here was my night, taking a crying girl back home after what looks like a shitty date. We sat in silence for a while, and I let her cry, her sobs barely a whisper underneath the sound of my radio. I couldn't help but look back at her. She was very pretty despite all that was going on. Did Dave hurt her? I was afraid to ask, but as we got closer to her destination, the questions were burning in the back of my head. I don't know what came over me. I wish I had kept my stupid mouth shut, but words floated away from my lips. Did Dave hurt you? My question was met with a cold silence that chilled the air around me. There were no sounds of sobbing, no sounds of movement, nothing at all coming from my back seat. A chill ran down my spine, freezing me in place as I looked into the rearview mirror to see that it was completely empty. I slammed on my brake again and shifted to park. I turned around to see that the car was empty aside from me driving. My heart began to race. The thumping rocked against my ribs and I started to sweat despite how cold I felt. Where had she gone? Did she jump out of my fucking car? Was I losing my shit? I hopped out of my car in the middle of the empty road and looked all around, but there was no sign of the woman in sight. In a frantic state, I even looked underneath my car. Of course, there was nothing there. I got back into the driver's seat and popped my head against the steering wheel. I clutched at my chest, trying to calm myself down. There was no way that I had seen a ghost. That kind of stuff just doesn't happen in real life. My mind tried to rationalize what had just happened until I heard a whisper that felt like a person's voice right next to my ear. Please take me home. I turned around to see nothing, only an empty back seat in my locked car. My eyes shifted back into the rearview mirror to see the image of a girl in the center behind me. Parts of her hair fell over the cracked glasses. Blood was running down her chin and neck, covered in purple bruises. I just sat there and stared as she began to writhe in her seat. Like some kind of creature in a horror movie, the sound of bones snapping echoing in my skull. Her arm snapped and grabbed at the headrest of my seat, and the one next to me. She slowly pulled herself towards me. I turned around to see her head now next to mine, and I wanted to throw up at the sight before me. The left side of her head was crushed in, and I saw in that space a hole with fragments of her skull visible. Blood poured out and splashed onto my right shoulder. She turned her head towards me, and she opened her mouth to show a bloodied mouth and missing teeth. Take me home. A distorted howl came from what was left of her throat, as the demand filled me with such horror, the sound much more frightening than what I was seeing before me. Without taking my gaze off her, I reached for the handle of the car door. Her eyes beneath the broken glasses were bloodshot red, and they darted to my left hand. Before I knew it, she had slithered to the front seat and pressed her hand onto mine. She gripped her small bruised hands, and I felt immense pain run through my arm. She removed her hand to reveal what was left of mine. My fingers were broken at every joint. I let out a scream, and she just looked at me now, with bloody tears streaming down her face. Drive! She howled again. So with my functioning hand, I turned on the engine and continued to drive to her destination. There were only 10 minutes left with no one on the road. I wanted to leave, but I didn't think she would let me, even if I tried. I kept driving despite the pain of my broken fingers, despite her bloody tears dropping onto me, despite the snapping noise of her neck as she tilted her head back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I couldn't help but think to myself, what did I do to deserve this? We were finally in front of a house, a simple house, a beautiful family home, and I slowed to a stop. I was shaking in my seat so badly as I looked at her staring at the house. I wanted her to go. I brought her to her destination, and I shouted, my mind, please go. But I sat there and stared at this entity next to me as it just stared out the window. She slowly turned her head back to me. She was now back to how I first saw her, and she whispered to me, I can never go home again. I blinked and as soon as my eyes opened, she was gone. I sat there for a moment longer, hoping that whoever was living here wouldn't see me parked outside their house like a weirdo. I looked at my left hand. It was normal. I looked around myself and the car, to find no bloodstains. "Fuck this," I shouted, and sped off into the night back home. I thought that I had really snapped or something. I called friends, parents, anyone who would just listen to me as I spouted a lunatic story. I made them worry, of course. I spent the next couple of days locked in my room like some madman. Then one of my friends sent me a recent news article, and I nearly passed out at what I saw. The article was about a young woman found murdered in an alleyway. The woman that was inside my car. I didn't think of anything else but calling the police and told them what had happened. Of course they didn't believe me about her being in the back seat, but they did believe me about Dave. There was a full-on investigation, but they couldn't find a trace of Dave. But to my dismay, they did find something in my car. On the floor of my back seat, they had found a memento that Dave must have left behind. Right behind my seat, lying on the floor of my car, were a pair of thin glasses with round frames. The lenses were broken and were stained with the young woman's blood.
I have found myself wondering whether I should share this with anyone. I found my grandmother's journal last week. It had been stored in the attic during the move to her new home. I'd gone over there to help her organize her things and to clean. I've always wanted to learn more about my family history. The book was leather bound, written in cursive, and was pretty thick. She wrote in it regularly throughout her life. The paper was slightly different when new sections had been added. I settled down to read it one day. It started when she was 9 years old. She spoke about her family, my great-grandparents and her siblings. It was pretty interesting to hear how she lived. She mentioned a friend of hers, her best friend, a small boy who lived across the street called Peter. Peter and her would frequently play together. It was pretty sweet. As I read, she wrote about her dreams and the rise of World War II, a war she lost both her father and her brother. She talked about the rationing, the bombs, and the stress of invasion. Yet, Peter remained consistent. I was curious as to why Peter was not called in to serve in either of the world wars. She didn't say. He was a regular feature in her writing. Otherwise, her childhood was quite unimpressive, so I'll skip to her teenage years. At first, I wondered whether or not Peter was a childhood ghost. A best friend, but it sounded like he aged as she did. She told me he grew tall and handsome. I felt a little strange reading this, and I knew I had no right to be. My grandfather's name was James, and I think she had a bit of a crush on Peter. She mentioned how her mother didn't approve of Peter, and by all accounts, I couldn't see the reason why. On the 13th of July, 1950, she began to have nightmares of a person watching outside her bedroom window. As I flicked through the pages, I noticed it was recurring and kept happening again and again. Each time, the figure became more and more clear. A black shadow with glowing eyes. When she spoke about it, her family told her to be quiet. There were many people in pain after the war ended, and life was returning to normal. They figured it was just a nightmare. When I turned the page, I saw the drawing of the figure. The eyes stared up at me, and I instantly began to feel uneasy. I kept reading more about Peter and my grandmother. They went on several dates and were courting, essentially dating with marriage in mind, so to speak. I couldn't read her journal one night and needed some time to rest. I placed a bookmark inside, lay down in bed, and turned on some relaxing music to fall asleep to, and began to flick through my phone. I liked a few pictures, commented on a few things, when I noticed a reflection. It happened so briefly. There was a black shadow. When I blinked, it was gone. I laughed to myself and decided it was definitely time for bed. I curled up and slept. I found myself in an empty room. The white paint was peeling off the walls, and the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, looked around, and thought I could see the shadow figure. Instead, I saw Peter, exactly as my grandmother had drawn and described him. He stared at me, unblinking. There was a stillness about him that frightened me. He said nothing, and I stepped backwards. That feeling would not disappear. I could see my breath, and I shivered in the cold. When I looked for the door, I discovered it was gone. I turned around and looked for Peter, half expecting him to be standing behind me, but he wasn't there. I was still trapped inside the doorless and windowless room. I shivered and ran my fingers along the surface of the wall, trying to find a way out. As my pace increased, I felt my heart rate rise, and I started to scratch at the wall, trying to find a way out. I needed to get out. I could feel eyes on me in the darkness, and I needed to get away from whatever it was. Please, please, I begged to myself. I felt a breath on the back of my neck. My scratching became louder. I could feel both the wallpaper and my fingernails peel away. I felt fingers moving through my hair. I tried to scream and no sound came out. I kept imagining the shadow figure behind me, ready to grab me and hurt me.
You need to run.
A voice came from the opposite end of the room. I looked in the direction and saw an open window, the night sky bright and the moon illuminating the room. I turned and ran, not looking back into the dark, and leapt out the window. I felt my body fall through the air, and when I was about to land, I woke up in my bed, breathless and coated in sweat. It was nothing but a nightmare. I got up, showered and brushed my teeth before checking the dark circles under my eyes. They were darker than they usually were. I leaned in close to study my eyes. Something about them looked different. I decided to ignore it for the time being, got dressed and brushed my hair. All I could think about was continuing to read my grandmother's journal. I kept thinking about Peter, the nightmare I had, and I found myself drawn to it. I opened it, lifted the bookmark, and started to read again. My grandmother wrote that Peter would come over to her house at all hours of the day or night. That, on the odd occasion, she would see him standing inside her room, staring at her from the corner, silent and unmoving. I felt a feeling of dread. Why was I now seeing him? I kept reading, and surprisingly the next few paragraphs were relatively quiet, uneventful. She met my grandfather, James, and only considered him to be a friend. As I kept reading, my eyes were drawn to the corners of the room, and I had a feeling I was being watched. My vision began to blur, and I could barely focus on the words in front of me. I kept hearing whispers around me. They went on for a long while. The shadow with the glowing eyes kept watching me, circling, and I wondered just how my grandmother had managed to escape. I opened my eyes and saw Peter, exactly like his photograph, exactly like how she had drawn him. He smiled at me. His face perfect, too perfect, and without any blemishment or sign of suffering. He didn't even look real. I reached out and placed my hands on either side of his cold cheeks, frozen to my touch, and leaned forward. My teeth sank into his skin, and he screeched in surprise. As I pulled away, I could taste the blood and the flesh. I chewed the raw meat, swallowed, and went in for the next bite. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. He didn't pull away. A feeble stop was all he muttered, and I continued to eat my fill. I gorged myself, my stomach bloated, and soon fell into a dreamless sleep. When I woke up, I could feel something in my teeth, and could taste the distinctive metal taste of blood. I opened my bedroom door to see my grandmother standing there. She pulled me into a loving hug, and I accepted it. I was confused. I didn't hear her come in. "Welcome to the family, darling," she whispered into my ear.
When you think of Halloween, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Well, if you're like me, the very first thing that comes to mind would be the costumes. From the generic store costumes to the intricate handcrafted designs. I would love to see how much fun people can have dressing up just for Halloween. Ever since I was a kid, I tried my best to conjure up the craziest costumes I could imagine. I even begged my grandmother to teach me how to sew, just so I could really make my ideas come to life. I got a lot of insults from the other kids. It was weird, being a boy that knows how to sew. But joke's on them. When Halloween came around, I'd always had the best costume, and they were always left in awe. Around this time of year, I was working on another costume for a huge party at a club downtown. I had planned on making an elaborate Dracula costume from the Netflix show Castlevania. One night, I had asked my grandmother for some help on some of the more complicated stitches. She told me to swing by the next day, so I went over to her place with a box full of fabric. My grandmother lived in a small apartment building downtown. I carried my fabric all the way to her place. I looked around and smiled as everyone was adding small Halloween decorations to their shops. I passed the nightclub and was excited to see the large sign for the costume contest. I was determined to win it. I finally made my way to my grandmother's unit when I noticed the door was cracked open. I put my box down and slowly pushed open the door. "Gran? Hey, you left your door open. Are you here?" I shouted. I was met with silence. It wasn't uncommon for my grandmother to leave the door unlocked, but I doubt she was getting on in the years enough to forget to close the door. I stepped through to look for her. I could hear voices coming from her television. I stepped towards her living room area and saw the back of my grandmother's head as she sat on the couch watching TV. "Hey, what's wrong? Couldn't you hear me?" I laughed as I walked over to her. I went around the couch to see her face, but I was shocked. I stumbled backwards and slammed against the TV. And there on the couch, I saw the corpse of my grandmother. Her eyes were wide in fear. She was completely covered in blood. Her neck was torn apart. I called the police. I'm surprised the dispatcher couldn't understand with me sobbing. The officers came and took me to the station. I explained to them what had happened, and they assured me that they would get to the bottom of it. My parents came and got me. I was hysterical. After they did an autopsy, we quickly held a funeral for my grandmother. During the visitation, I heard everyone whisper that she was murdered, and that there was a serial killer going around the city. and the police were keeping things under wraps to avoid a panic. I didn't want to think about that. My grandmother was the kindest person I knew. How could anyone think about killing her? My friend, who I've known for years, Laura, kept me sane during the whole ordeal. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't have made it through the funeral. I cried, and she was there for me the whole time.
It's okay, Maddie.
She said, trying to comfort me. Her dulcet voice drowned out the whispers of the people around us. The days had passed and I was a complete wreck. I couldn't get over what I saw. My grandmother's bloodied face, mouth open wide in a scream. My family and friends kept checking up on me, but I didn't want to leave my room. Eventually, Halloween came and Laura insisted that I come out to the club later that night.
Come on, Matt. You can't run away at home.
Laura pleaded. I don't know. She grabbed my hands and looked up at me.
Please, I hate seeing you like this. Let's just go out for an hour at least, get some air, and see some people.
I was reluctant to go out. Thinking about Halloween kept reminding me of my grandmother. Everything reminded me of her. But maybe Laura was right. I couldn't live like this. My grandmother would cry if she saw me wasting away. So I got dressed. I didn't have a costume, so I just wore my normal clothes. Laura came to pick me up, and I laughed as she showed off her bee costume. We made our way downtown to the club. The air was cold, and everything was especially festive that night. We saw all types of different costumes, and to be honest, it really cheered me up. We were just outside the club, and there was a huge crowd of people outside, all of them dressed up, hoping to win the costume contest. I was enamored by the amazing ideas people had for their costumes, but one really caught my eye. No one else seemed to notice them, but I couldn't stop staring. They were covered head to toe in a long, dark brown cloak. In the first glance, you'd think there was some kind of fantasy character. They walked through the crowd so effortlessly, it seemed as though they were gliding through the people. I stepped forward to get a closer look at their costume. Laura called out to me in confusion, but I thought I saw something odd about that person's costume. The figure had stopped at an alleyway looking towards the crowd. I had to make sure if what I was seeing was true. I was a couple of feet away when a group of guys dressed in togas had emerged from the alleyway screaming. The figure's head twisted towards them, and I saw its face. Its hood fell back, and I saw something so grotesque. It had what looked like the face of a young woman with patches of blonde hair, but the face didn't fit. It was as if someone had put their mask on wrong, or more like the mask was too small for their face. The figure slowly turns its head toward me, and I saw near edges of the mouth and eyes. There were thick streams of blood running down. The flesh that it was wearing was gray and rotting. It smiled at me. I saw its sharp teeth smile at me behind the lips of another woman's mouth. It waved at me. I rubbed my eyes. Was I seeing things? Then I looked towards it and it was gone.
Matt! Matthew!
Laura called out to me.
What are you doing standing here?
Did you see that?
Did I see what?
The thing standing over there. Ugh. Never mind. Let's head inside for a drink. Whatever that thing I saw was, it was really unsettling. Maybe it was just really good makeup effects. Maybe I'm hallucinating. But that image of the thing smiling at me behind the rotting face mask made me not want to be sober anymore. So Laura and I had a few shots, and once we started feeling the buzz, she ran towards the dance floor where I reluctantly followed. We were in the middle of a crowd of costume dancers. Everyone was having a pretty good time, and Laura was screaming to the song the DJ was playing. I looked around and saw some people dressed as some anime characters, a few witches, a werewolf, and that hooded figure. It was gliding through the groups of dancers, and the lights strobed to the beat. It looked as though it was fading in and out of existence, like a phantom. I just stopped dancing and stared at it. I was so afraid. Its movements were not human. It moved through the people, but no one else seemed to notice it like I did. It lifted its arms to reveal its hands, or what should have been hands. It had long fingernails. Each nail had to be half a foot long that pierced through the flesh of its hands. As I looked closer, I was sure of what I had been seeing. This was not a makeup effect. It had been wearing someone else's skin, and it was way too big for it. It began to brush its fingernails along the side of those around it. I looked in terror as no one seemed to be reacting to it. Then suddenly, it stopped at a woman dressed as a cat. The woman was dancing away until the figure grabbed her and then pulled her down, sinking her into the crowd of dancers. A scream erupted, then everyone in the club followed with their own screams. What the fuck just happened? Laura had grabbed my hands and pulled me towards her.
Hey fella, are you having a good time so far?
She asked. Yeah. I think the liquor is getting to me. She smiled and led me back to the bar. She ordered a couple more shots and handed me one.
I'm glad you're out, Maddie. I've been really worried about you.
She said. I didn't know how to respond to her. I was too distracted. Something was in this club. Some kind of monster was going around and taking people. I kept my eyes glued to the dance floor. I saw the figure re-emerge. This time, it was covered in blood. Its face splashed with crimson, and this time, the edges of its mouth were torn apart to its ears, revealing bits of its true face underneath. Underneath the strobing lights, I could see parts of its flesh under its rotting mask. It had red, fleshy skin with rows of sharp teeth. As the white light hit its eyes, I could see that they glowed a bright yellow. Blood was dripping from its teeth as it surveyed the crowd. It looked towards the man dressed as a nerd. And again, he grabbed its victim and sank underneath the crowd. A portion of the crowd shifted, and I saw it was crouched onto the floor, its teeth sinking into the man's neck. It sprayed blood onto the nearby people, but they were all engulfed into the pleasure of the party that they didn't notice. How the hell could no one notice this fucking monster? I looked back at Laura, and she was staring back at me, smiling. Bathroom break, I blurted out. I stepped away from the bar, but before I left, I grabbed the corkscrew that the bartender had left. I didn't know what was going on, but seeing this thing take another victim, tearing their throat, reminded me of my grandmother. Was this thing responsible? It was really strong. Will this thing even hurt it? I gripped the corkscrew tightly in my hand as I quickly stepped towards it. It took its long nails and stuck it into the man's body. It began to tear at his skin and feast on it. It noticed me as I got closer and dropped the corpse, disappearing once again. Where did it go? Was it toying with me? Why wasn't anyone else seeing this thing? I looked frantically for it. I saw Laura walking towards me with confusion on her face.
Hey, you're not okay, are you?
She shouted, but I couldn't pay attention to her as I saw that monster looming behind her. I yanked her closer towards me and she yelped. The monster took a step back and took its long sharp nails and began to tear away at its rotten mask, revealing its full red flesh face, its true face. Its yellow eyes burned as it stared at me. It was completely bald, and its ears were long and pointed. It began to look around. Its ears perked as it dashed through the crowd again. I didn't care where it was going, as long as it was away from us. We have to go right now, I yelled. Laura didn't know how to respond as I led her away from the dance floor.
What the hell is going on?
She asked. She didn't want to waste any time, so I pulled out my phone to call the police. When we were outside, Laura pulled my hand away from her.
Matthew, you've been acting weird all fucking night. Now explain to me what is going on.
She shouted. Something is in there. I screamed. Something is snatching up people and killing them. Laura put her hands over her mouth.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Matt. I thought you'd have fun going out. But maybe it was too soon.
Just as she said that, I saw that thing behind her. The hooded monster. Except this time, it had a fresh new costume. It looked like one of those guys that was wearing a toga from before. This body was a bit bigger, so the skin hung loosely over its fleshy body. It crept closer and closer, and I yelled, "Laura!" The monster had dug its nails into Laura's arm, and she screamed. Her cries of pain were followed by cries of laughter from the partygoers. It pulled its nails out of her and began to lick the blood off of them. She looked at me in horror, tears in her eyes as I shouted, "Run!" I grabbed her uninjured arm and we booked it. The cold air was burning my lungs as we tried to escape. I looked back and saw Laura frantically trying to keep up as the monster was gliding towards us. We ran and ran, but it was unrelenting. Laura was sobbing uncontrollably. We didn't stop running, couldn't stop. This thing was fast and strong. It could end us easily. Was it just toying with us? I could hear it behind our cries. It's breathing. It sounded like some kind of wild animal. When it breathed, it sounded like a deep and guttural growl. The road that we were on was completely desolate. Fuck. I didn't pay any attention to where we were going. Where were we? I wasn't fucking thinking. I just tried to escape. Did it lead us here? Were we surrounded by broken and abandoned buildings? It slowed down and began to inch its way towards us.
Matt! Matt! What do we...
She stopped as we began to hear growling coming from all around us. It wasn't just one thing chasing us. I looked around and saw a couple more of these creatures. There were 4 more, each of them wearing someone else's skin, and they were stepping slowly towards us. Laura's arm was dripping with blood onto the concrete below us. "Help! We need help!" I shouted. My yells were echoing through the night. Laura looked at me, my friend. I loved her so much and I couldn't do anything to comfort her. She gripped my hand tightly and I stared into her eyes. I gripped her hand back and then suddenly she was gone. I looked down and saw I was still holding her hand. The creatures had ripped away from me and were feasting upon her. I was so afraid. I didn't know what to do. I did the only thing my instincts would allow me to do, and I ran. I ran with all my might, holding on to the only part of my friend Laura that I had left. I turned and saw her. She stared at me and tried to scream, but the creatures piled onto her. I turned away to keep on running and running and running. At some point, I passed out. I passed out from all the fear, all of the running. Someone had called the police. They had reported someone screaming through the city at night, holding a bloodied hand. When the officers found me, they found me collapsed in the middle of the street. When I awoke, I found myself at the police station. They questioned me about what happened that night, and I told them everything. About the monsters and their flesh costumes. About the people that they had killed. About Laura. But they didn't believe me. They found some alcohol in my system, so they assumed I was drunk. But what about those people those monsters murdered? They didn't find any bodies. They didn't find Laura's body. But they did have a lot of missing persons reports. I balled my hand into a fist. I gripped it so tightly and asked them about what happened to Laura's hand. They didn't know what I was talking about. You may think I'm crazy. I'm telling you, I'm a witness to horrific murder starting with my grandmother. I don't blame you if you think I'm crazy, but it's true. Something is going around the city. Maybe the world, and it's fucking smart. It's fast. It's powerful. It's using human skin in attempts to blend in, if you would even call that blending in. Nonetheless, there are monsters out there, and they're using a very realistic costume.
Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. What a time of year, ain't it? I still remember my first Halloween. My first real Halloween, mind you. Not the manufactured bullshit that they shovel down our throats year after year. I'm talking about All Hallows Eve. I'm talking about Samhain. I'm talking about the one night of the year when monsters walk the earth. I was 11 years young when I first experienced the horror of Halloween. I'd been out with a friend, roaming the streets with bags full of wrappers and stomachs full of candy. We'd been out looking for some fun, some excitement. See, once you reach a certain age, plain old trick-or-treating doesn't really do it anymore. No, you need something special, something terrifying. I think that's why we took a stroll down Blackbriar Lane. And I think that's why we went looking for the decrepit one in all his wicked glory. And I think that's why I watched somebody die. But am I getting ahead of myself, aren't I? Yes, I suppose that I am. So let's rewind, backtrack, allow me to set the scene. It's October 31st and the night air is crisp. The leaves are red and gold, and the neighborhood is lit up in jack-o'-lanterns and full moons. There's mischief in the air. There's murder. Earlier that week, a kid dies. They find his body floating down the river like he's out for a swim. Except, he's fully dressed and missing his head. You ever try to identify a body without a head? Without teeth? Well, apparently it's easy. See, little Greggy Hall had a nice mom, the sort that most of us can only dream of having. And the lovely lady went ahead and stitched his name right onto the side of his jacket. And just like that, we knew who was dead. Open and shut, case closed. But what was he doing then, without his head, floating down the river, when he should have been in bed? Was it a prank gone wrong? Maybe the poor kid slipped walking across the trestle. Or maybe, just maybe, somebody sick and twisted was out for blood, and the innocent little Greggy was too good a target to pass up. Who could say? Truth is, nobody had a clue. Not the sheriff, not his mother, not a single soul in town could have told you how little Greggy came to find himself so waterlogged and pale. But here's the thing about secrets. None of them last forever. This one didn't even last the week. It was me and Andy who figured it out late on Halloween night. We took the turn down Blackbriar Lane because that was the way you made it into Shelton Wood, and that was the place they'd found Greggy Hall's decapitated corpse. And before I go any further, I want you to know that I don't mean Greggy any disrespect. He was a good kid, a kind kid. But that night though, in the heart of October, he had become so much more than that. He'd become a legend, a ghost story come to life. That night, Greggy Hall became the reason that I don't celebrate Halloween. And that night, I crossed Blackbriar Bridge with Andy Delton, and together, the two of us walk into Shelton Wood. The trees there are like nowhere else. They're thick, almost so thick that they press in on each other like blades of grass, smothering for space. And once you step beneath the Shelton canopy, it really doesn't matter if the moon is crescent or full as the sun. You're not going to see a damn thing. It's dark in there, desperately so. We used our flashlights to navigate, doing our best not to tear our costumes on the branches as we passed by. My mother had spent all month sewing my Dracula outfit, and Andy had saved up half a year's allowance for his Spider-Man getup. We weren't about to walk out of there full of rips and holes. No way. But we had work to do. See, Andy and I knew something about Shelton that not the sheriff or Gregory's mother or even the pastor knew. We knew that Gregory Hall had been talking about hearing voices in the woods on the way home from school. We knew he'd said he saw something watching him from the trees. We knew all of this because his sister, Sally, was in our grade, and she'd told us about how religious their mother was, how fanatical. She told us her mother once convinced the pastor to drag Sally into the woods and then perform an exorcism on her. She told us she thought her mother's paranoia was starting to wear off on poor little Greggy. So when Greggy started talking about hearing voices, seeing things, we thought it was just nonsense, make-believe. After all, he wasn't describing seeing a man, woman, or animal in the trees. He was describing something, a monster. He was describing seeing a nightmare come to life, and even out here, in this little slice of nowhere on the edge of the map, we knew that monsters weren't real. We thought we did. But then pop goes little Greggy's head, and the next thing you know, we are fast believers. So fast, in fact, that we brought the news straight to the police. Guess what happened then? They chucked our statements into a drawer and told us that they'd looked into it. First, the damn pastor wants to ban access to Shelton Wood, and now the kids are saying it's haunted. We heard them laughing all the way up until the door closed behind us. The town is full of nut jobs. No, it was up to us. We thought about inviting Greggy's sister along, but we knew she wanted time alone. Time to mourn her brother, and that was fine by us. This whole thing, this little investigation of ours, was just a scouting mission anyway. We weren't expecting to encounter the creature that stalked Gregory Hall from the trees. We weren't expecting to fight for our lives. But then, these things so rarely go according to plan. We spent an hour roaming Shelton before we realized that we were lost. We'd been trying to follow the river, but at one point, Andy swore he heard muttering coming from over the hill, and so the two of us clambered up it to investigate, and all we found there were old pine trees and empty dark. We turned around to circle back, but the river was gone. It vanished. We did our best to retrace our steps. We even followed our noses, hoping we could smell the stink of the town sewage that ran into the river. But it was no use. The river was lost, and so were we. We walked for 10, maybe 15 minutes before the sounds of the forest died. The shifting of branches, the pitter-patter of rodents darting across the dirt, the buzz of mosquitoes, and even the trill of crickets, all turned to silence. It was like somebody had hit the switch on a stereo. Instant quiet. Andy and I stopped to listen, to observe, and we saw something shift in the trees. A large figure, maybe twice the size of a man, with round white eyes and a long, twisting neck, was perched above us on a thick branch. It clicked at us. At first, we thought it was speaking, trying to communicate. But then we realized the clicking wasn't coming from its face. It was coming from its hands. Its fingers, long and crooked, seemed to splinter into separate appendages, On either one of its hands were fans of hundreds of fingers, each gripping the tree branch, while their nails picked away at the bark beneath. That picking was making the clicking sounds its fingers were. Andy tried to speak to it. He tried to ask what it was doing here, to ask whether or not it was the thing that had killed poor little Greggy Hall. As though there were any doubt in our minds. But at that moment, the monster's fingers gripped the branch with such force that the entire thing snapped in two. The creature began plummeting to the earth like a giant, and I thought maybe our work would be done and gravity would put an end to it. But it let loose a shrill shriek and flapped its many-fingered hands like wings and pressed itself up into the air. It shrieked again, and its eyes, once wide and round, became an acid painting of colors, horrible and bright and anguishing. There weren't any reds or purples or greens. There were only the colors of blood, of bruises, of bile. It screeched again and then swooped towards us. My heart thundered as I threw myself to the ground. But the thing is, whatever it was, caught Andy in its grip. It caught him by his head in 2 feet that resembled human jaws more than anything else. They were covered in white teeth, and it was at that moment that I knew I would never see my friend again. And I think he knew too. Andy shook and hollered. He screamed and shouted. But all of it was only for the span of 6 seconds, because not a moment later, the thing clenched its jaws, its feet, and Andy's head split open like a jack-o'-lantern, his insides splattering me like a water balloon. I had to go. I turned, running full tilt from this thing. I didn't know where I was running. I didn't even know if I could reasonably run anywhere that this monster couldn't reach me. But I knew that I had to try. I had to, because if I didn't then, I would end up just like Andy, just like Greggy. And as my feet pounded the earth, my heart pounded my chest, and I ripped off my Dracula cloak, terrified of it tripping me up on an errant rock, and I doubled over as my lungs burned. I've never run so hard in my life, never so fast, and it wasn't enough. Not even close. With a beat of its finger wings, the beast crashed down in front of me. It towered above me, standing over 9 feet tall with its terrible technicolor eyes swirling like promises of violence. "Looking for me?" it uttered, in such a low, broken voice that I almost missed it. "You killed Greggy," I said. It seemed a stupid, obvious thing to say after watching my best friend's head crack open like an egg yolk, but it was all I could manage. And at that moment, I was so shocked, so traumatized, that I reverted to our hypothesis, our mission. "Yes," the thing said. It rose up and now I could see it clearer. Beneath the faint scraps of moonlight that pierced the veil of leaves, I bore witness to a monster with saucer-shaped eyes, a set of long arms ending in legions of decrepit fingers, and 2 legs that each hosted a mouth where there should have been feet. It stepped toward me, walking on its teeth. "Who are you?" I asked, swallowing. "Are you him? The decrepit one?" It took a breath, a long, harsh breath that sounded like it might have gurgled razor blades in its lungs. And when it spoke, it breathed cold air onto me. "I am you." It took another tooth-filled step, and I staggered backwards. My world spun, but I wasn't sure if that was because of my fear, or my grief at losing Andy, or the awful kaleidoscope of horror playing out in its swirling eyes. "What does that mean?" It didn't respond. It reached a hand out toward me, and its eyes rolled faster and faster, like a blender of madness, and its teeth snapping as it took its next steps. "Pelere!" shouted a voice. The monster recoiled, its long neck twisted like a snake as its eyes blinked and faded like a television reception, dying in the storm. It curled into a ball, wrapping itself with its hundreds of fingers before disappearing into a gust of dead leaves. I took a breath. Above, the moon seemed to glow a little brighter, and beside me, the sound of the river returned. Crickets filled the night, and the wind whistled in my ears. It was as though the world had come back into focus, and that I'd been pulled out of a dream, all because of... "Hello?" I said, wheeling about. There'd been a voice, a loud one, that was commanding and full of authority and speaking a language that I didn't understand. But where was... Oh, there he was, down by the river. "You all right, son?" the pastor asked. I shook my head and said, "No, my friend's dead, and..." "Yes, I see what's left of him on your shirt." The pastor paused, looking me over. "What made you go looking for that creature?" "It killed Gregory Hall," I sputtered. "We wanted proof." "No such thing. Not when it comes to the decrepit one. It's closer to a thought than a being of flesh and blood. You can't take pictures of it, can't record audio. Believe me, I've tried. It feeds off of fear. It feeds off of people like your friend, like you, who go looking for nightmares in all the right places. If it gets stronger enough, we lose." He must have registered the confusion on my face. "By which I mean that we die. This town, you and me, your mother and father and sisters and brothers, all of us will fall into its deadly reverie, and poof, off goes our heads." "How do we stop it?" "We don't. Or at least you don't. I do. I brought it here after all, so it only makes sense that I should be the one to risk getting rid of it." "You brought it here?" "Yes. When I performed the exorcism on Sally Hall, it had been living in her, see? Hiding. Her mother noticed it, bless her heart, and she requested that I remove the being from her daughter. But it was powerful, too powerful for me to destroy, and so instead, I had to compromise, think quickly. I swallowed, the pieces beginning to line up in my head. You had to chain it here, didn't you? To this forest?" The pastor nodded and said, "It was all that I could do." He sighed, put an arm around my shoulders and told me that he would walk me home. He explained that after what happened to Gregory, he had been petitioning the mayor to block access to Shelton Wood out of respect, to have it marked as a burial ground, a memorial. He told me that there had been some pushback at that time. Folks didn't want to sacrifice a slice of forest for a single dead kid. But now that the same fate had befallen Andy, he counted on the mayor changing his tune. And by the next week, the mayor had. The section of Shelton was closed off to everybody but investigators. And soon enough, even they quit coming through. It became a dead zone, a piece of the map that didn't exist anymore. Far as anybody was concerned, the simple fact was there were too many bad memories, too many reminders of the horror that had taken place there. It's been years now, and I no longer celebrate Halloween. I can't. It reminds me of Andy, of little Greggy, and of the decrepit one with all its fingers. For a while there, I thought I'd actually moved past all of this, left it behind me. But then tonight, I saw something from my window that sent my blood cold. Amidst the shifting clouds of the black Halloween sky, framed in the light of the moon, was a large bird. A bird with 1,000 fingers on either hand and feet lined with teeth. A bird flying away from Shelton Wood. A bird flying to town.
My name is Kevin Wilson. I only thought it was right to write about what happened to me and my family. Before my incident, I was a very logical and skeptical man. I don't believe in Bigfoot, werewolves, ghosts, or anything of that nature. They were just silly bedtime stories that my mother used to tell me. Nowadays, I'm not too sure what to believe. When I close my eyes, I can see her. Anyway, before I get too ahead of myself, I should probably start at the very beginning. Back before I met those things. My wife Monica and I lived in Reno, Nevada for basically our whole lives. When my wife got pregnant, I was so happy. All my life, I had wanted to be a father and teach my child how to grow up in this world. I can still remember the day my son was born. He was so small and fragile, and I was so happy that my dream finally came true. Of course, I was happy for Monica, as well giving birth to our beautiful child, Toby. A few years after Toby's birth, Monica and I started to talk about moving. We wanted to get out of the city and desert and find a nice small community somewhere where we can raise our son. We searched for weeks, hundreds of cities in every state that didn't have a desert in it. Finally, after weeks of searching for the perfect city, Monica found the city of Juneau. It was the capital of Alaska, and yet it only had about 30,000 people in it. We checked our budget and came to the conclusion that we would move to Juneau. When the plane landed in Juneau, it was raining. Not heavily raining, mind you, just drizzling more or less. We were told by some locals that it rains quite a bit in Juneau. We didn't mind though. We had already made plans on renting a house and getting interviews for jobs before we moved up there, just to be on the safe side. We took a cab and started our way to our house, which was in a part of Juneau they called Douglas. We had to cross the bridge to get to Douglas, which we learned from the cab driver was a large island next to the mainland Juneau. He dropped us off in front of our house, and what a view we had of the water. We were on the beachfront and had our own stretch of beach where we can go straight onto the water. It was very beautiful, and we had thought that we had made the right choice for everyone. As we settled into our new house, I remember glancing outside to see an animal floating in the water, staring towards our house. I knew nothing about animals, but I thought I should take a picture of it to symbolize that this was our good luck symbol. By the time I got in the camera and back to the window, it was gone. I didn't know at the time, but the animal I had seen was an otter. That night, I was woken up by strange noises coming from the beach. I got out of bed and looked out the window to see dark silhouettes running on all fours. I managed to grab my camera and snapped a few photos of the things, and I went back to bed. Next morning, I showed Monica and Toby the pictures of the animals. They were amazed of the animals, and Monica thought that whatever they were cute. When I went to work, I showed some of my coworkers the pictures, and one of them blurted out, "Oh, those are sea otters. They're playing on your property." I remember asking him if they were dangerous. He replied with, Only if provoked, or unless it's a kushtaka. Everyone but me laughed at what seemed to be a joke that went straight over my head.
Hey! Don't make fun of them.
The new voice startled me, and I spun around to see who it was. It was a man who appeared to be an Alaskan native. The other side, I went back to work, except me. I wanted to know what this kushtaka was. I asked him why you shouldn't make fun of them, and he replied with the classic.
You're not from around here, are you?
I shook my head since there was no sense of lying.
Well, kushtaka is a Tinglet word, meaning otter people. They're known for being shapeshifters and killing and eating humans.
I went home that day thinking about how stupid that sounded. Shapeshifting human otters? What joke was that? A few nights later, I was in the living room watching TV, while Monica went to go drop Toby off at a friend's for a sleepover. As I sat there, I heard a sort of scratching coming from the back door. I got up to look, and as I reached for the handle, I heard the sounds of a baby crying on the other side. I froze as the sound made my hair stand up in the end. The crying was coming from the outside of the door, where I just heard the scratching noises. I wasn't skeptical, as I said before, but for a brief instant, every horror movie I've ever watched came back to me. I shook the feeling off and opened the door. I looked down, and staring at me with green, bright eyes was an otter. That was very concerning for me, considering there was no baby there. I stared at it for a few seconds before I tried to nudge it away with my shoe. As I touched it, it hissed at me and swiped at me, taking a good chunk of skin with it. I yelped in pain, and the otter scurried back to the water. I sat down holding my wound as it dripped blood onto the hardwood floor, and looked up to witness the otter stand on two legs, looking back at me. It gave me an eerily human-like grin, showing its sharp teeth and licked its claws. I don't know if my heart had ever beat that hard before, but I can honestly say that I've never been that scared for my life before. I quickly got up and slammed the back door shut and locked all the doors and windows. When Monica got home, I told her about what happened to me and showed her my wound. She took me to the hospital, and she continuously tried to convince me that I was just in shock and imagined the whole thing. I know what I saw, though, and I didn't know how to explain it to her without sounding crazy. After getting a series of rabies and tetanus shots, we went home. As we walked to the front door, we could see that our house was thrashed. Furniture torn up and scattered everywhere. Dishes shattered and everything else in between. As Monica called 911, I noticed that the back door was wide open. It had huge claw marks running down it. When the authorities arrived, they told us that it looked like a bear had gotten in. I told them that I locked the back door, and they responded with,
That's a strange behavior for a bear.
We cleaned up the mess when the authorities left and went to bed. It took me a long time to sleep because with every creak of the house, I was reminded of that smile and the otter they gave me, it licking my blood off its claws. Weeks after that happened, I was at the table eating breakfast with Monica. Toby then came down the stairs rubbing his eyes and looked at us. I will never forget the words that he said next. He looked right at me and said, "The outer people told me last night they wanted to kill me." My heart sank at hearing these words, and every time I think about that day and what he said. Anyway, after he said that, Monica blamed me for filling his head with scary stories. She and I drove Toby to school and argued the rest of the way home. about whose fault it was for what Toby had said. That night, I couldn't sleep very well. The thought of what Toby said and Monica and I were fighting. I was a little on edge and restless. So I thought I would just sit in the chair in the living room. I sat down and started to doze off. Right as I heard a crying baby like before, I sat up confused and then became scared for Toby. I got up and ran to his room to check him. I opened the door to his room and froze in utter fear. Standing over his bed was some ungodly hideous. It had the body of an otter, standing only about 5 feet tall. Its hands were like those of a human's, but it had large, curved claws instead of fingernails. Its face was that of an half otter and half man, with that same crooked smile. It stared into my eyes with its hypnotic eyes and turned slowly towards me. I shook myself out of my trance and looked at it, to only feel its sharp claws enter my shoulder, and its heavy body pouncing on me, knocking me to the ground. It let out a piercing screech as it leapt off my body and ran to the door. I laid on the ground holding my bleeding shoulder as a loud shatter echoed through the house, followed by the sound of Toby sobbing uncontrollably. I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital with bandages around my arm and a few tubes sticking out of me. I looked around the room and saw Monica and Toby sitting next to me. Monica leaned down and kissed me softly, and Toby hugged me. I was so overjoyed to find out that they were safe. I actually cried. The doctor told me that by my wounds, it looked like I was attacked by a bear. I argued, of course, because I know that I was not attacked by a bear. It was one of those Kushtaka things. But as I tried to plead my case to them, they told me that I must have just dreamt it. I couldn't believe that no one was listening to what I was saying. I know that I most definitely sound like I imagined it, but it was still the truth. I stayed at the hospital for a few nights longer to fully recover. My last night there, I had a very weird dream. I was under the water swimming in the rain. I popped up above the surface of the water and was staring at my house. I turned my head and glanced at what looked like 4 otters surrounding me and nodded. We all then began to swim towards my house. I woke up in an absolute panic. I looked outside as the rain poured against my window. I had to get out of here and go check on my family immediately. I got dressed, and since I was on the first floor of the hospital, just jumped out the window. I ran as fast as I could, hoping that it was all nothing more than just a dream, and I would find them asleep in their beds. As I got to the front step of my house, I collapsed on the welcome mat, gasping for air. I was soaked down to the bone, and my lungs felt like they were being crushed. As I regained my strength, I opened the front door slowly and was greeted with the darkness of my house. I tried the lights, but they didn't turn on. I gulped and stepped inside further, noticing the slight breeze coming from the side of the house. I could see the back door was wide open. My heart was beating faster. I walked towards my family's rooms. As I walked closer, my vision had trouble adjusting to the pitch blackness that surrounded me. Suddenly, I slipped into something that squished under my weight and slipped out from under me. I landed on my back, immediately gasped as the air knocked out of me. I lay there for a few seconds before I looked to see what made me trip. Lying on the ground next to me was a body with its entrails ripped out, limbs torn off, and face skinned. I stared in horror, for even though this person was virtually unrecognizable, I knew it was my Monica. I turned away from it, not wanting to look at that abomination. Tears fell down my face as reality started to slowly sink in. After a few minutes, I heard a scream from outside. It was Toby. I got up quickly, shaking off the pain rushing down my back and heart. I sprinted out the back door to the beachhead. I stopped as I looked into the green eyes of the Kushtaka. It was grinning crookedly as it held Toby by his hair. Toby kicked and screamed, trying to get away from this thing's clutches. I cursed at it. "Let go of my son, you bastard! Take me instead!" The Kushtaka smiled more, showing its razor-sharp teeth as he did. It acted like my pleas for mercy entertained it. It held Toby up further and put its hands under him, holding him like a child. It slowly started to pet under his hair as it spoke in a crackled, dry voice. No matter what has or will happen in my life, I will never forget that awful voice and what it said. It stared into my eyes and said,
"No, I enjoy this too much."
With those words, it pulled Toby's neck back and sank his teeth into my son's neck. I screamed and watched in horror as it tore my son's neck out and threw him at me. Toby landed on the ground with a thump, and I watched him die in front of me. The Kushtaka laughed and dove into the water, swimming into the black water. After the cops cleaned up the mess, and I was released after being questioned for murdering my family, I flew back down to Reno so I could be away from the ocean. I will always remember everything that happened while we were up there, and I will never forget those things that lurk in the ocean. Because of the Kushtaka, I will never go anywhere near the ocean again. I cannot sleep in the dark anymore, and every time I hear a baby's cry, I am reminded of those green eyes and that horrible smile. The thing that will remember most of all, that will be the voice of what it said to me.
"No, I enjoy this too much."
I wish I never moved into the city. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to be closer to work, and there's so much more you can do here. In the countryside, it was a 15-minute drive to find someplace to eat, and a 30-minute drive to the nearest grocery store. Nothing was even open past 8 p.m. But here, I could leave work at 11 p.m. and find myself a movie theater or a restaurant right across the street. I was loving it. My dog, however, was less than thrilled. Shelby was a good girl, some sort of retriever. Almost golden, but not quite. Closer to a reddish brown. She had long, fluffy ears that would swing and sway as she ran, and a tail that would never stop wagging. But ever since we moved, she hasn't been the same. Eating less, sleeping more, signs enough for me to get worried. My concerns reached new heights when she started to run away. The first night she ran, I was belligerent. I wandered through the streets trying to call her name and explain to the officers on the phone what had happened at the same time. For 3 hours I searched, only returning home because it was dark, and the police had promised me that they would look for her. When I returned home that night and found her patiently waiting at the front door, I was not ashamed to admit I cried a little. There was no scolding, no anger. I was just happy to have her back. Then she ran away again. It became routine. Every week she'd run away at least once, sometimes twice. only to return at my door a few hours later, waiting to be let inside. I scoured the house for any hole, crack, or crevice she could have been slipping out through, but found nothing. It was as if she was simply turning the lock and walking out, closing the door behind her. My friends recommended a shock collar to keep her in check, but I could never do that to her, though it did give me an idea. I fixed a little GPS to her collar, the kind they sell for keeping track of cats and dogs, and waited. It didn't take long for her to run away again, and I sat in my car prepared to follow her. I was stopped by a sudden realization. She's been happier, hasn't she? Ever since she started running away, her attitude has done a 180. She sleeps less, wags her tail more, and just seems to be in a generally better mood. I figured she just needed a chance to run around and stretch her legs, but I knew that sooner or later she would get hurt. So I started to follow the signal. As my car went from pleasantly lit streets to rolling down dark graveled alleyways, I started to sweat. What was she doing down here? I figured I'd find her at a park or someone else's yard bothering their cat. Not in some dark alley. Eventually, I reached a narrow path and had to get out of my car to travel it. Shimmering past a rusty chain-link fence and into someone's backyard? Sat surrounded by tall brick walls was a little green lot. Bushes and trees around the edge with a clear, unobstructed center. It was such an odd spot for a plot like this, like a tiny park wedged between buildings. The only way in or out was through that little chain fence. I peered past the bushes, and just beyond them in the center of the lot with 4 other dogs was my Shelby. I quickly pulled out my phone and took a few pictures. It was so cute to see my dog sneaking off to play with friends, like something out of a Pixar movie. I stood up, no longer trying to hide, and looked around the lot for anyone who might own the other dogs. There was no one else around, just me and the dogs. I stepped out of the bushes towards them and froze. Something was off. Shelby always jumps on me to greet me, but now she stood statue still, staring at me. All of them did, actually. Not a single one of them moved an inch other than their eyes, which followed me as I approached, just looking at me, heads low to the ground, tails stiff as stone. They looked like they should have been growling, but none of them made a sound. Shelby? I called hesitantly, but she didn't respond. I reached out to touch her, about to pat her head, but stopped myself. I felt so sure that if I touched her then, something would happen. My gut told me to leave, but I didn't want to go without my dog. Shelby, come on. I pleaded, but she only stared at me. I left, squeezing past the fence, getting in my car and driving home. As I drove, I thought about what I should do. She'd be back, right? She always came back, always happy as can be. Would she be like that again, or would she be somehow she was in that alley? Maybe she just thought she was in trouble or didn't like that I found her secret spot. Though that wasn't like her. She would be fine once she came home, I decided. I just needed to wait. Hours rolled by at a snail's pace. I tried playing video games, reading, listening to music, anything to distract myself from my thoughts, but I couldn't stop worrying about Shelby. Each tick of the clock sounded like her nails on the concrete floor outside. Every bark had me checking out my window to see if it was her coming home. Finally, around 1 a.m. I fell asleep. In my dreams, I was in an alley again, walking towards the lot. It was dark out and I couldn't see past the fence. But as I got near, I could hear growling. and soon I saw two glowing yellow eyes staring at me from outside, slowly raising high and higher until whatever they belonged to stepped over the fence and began to come towards me. I sat up on the couch, rubbing my eyes and looking around my living room. It was still dark. A look at my phone told me it was 3:01 a.m., and I sighed, standing up and preparing to go to the bedroom when I heard something. My body went stiff, ears straining to catch the sound again, eyes wide as I slowly spun, searching the room for the source of the sound. It had sounded like an exhale, sharp, fast, and close. I nearly jumped out of my skin when someone pounded on the front door.
"Who is it?"
I called as I pressed my eye to the people, but I saw no one, and no one answered. I waited for a long time, listening hard and staring through that hole into the night outside, when finally someone knocked again. I didn't see their face or body, but what I did see is their hand raise up and strike the door 3 times.
"I said, who is it?"
I called again, more aggressive this time. Whoever was outside, I wanted them to think I wasn't some pushover. Hopefully they would leave me alone. They still didn't answer, but I began to hear movement outside the door, a scratching sound like nails scraping against concrete, and for a moment my eyes went wide. I dropped to my knees, pressing my cheek against the ground and checking under the door. There in front of me, sniffing hard like she just caught my scent, was my big reddish-brown snoot of a dog. My dog. I yanked the door open hard, arms already out and ready for Shelby to jump up into them. But there was nothing on the other side.
"Shelby?"
I called out in confusion, stepping outside, looking around, seeing nothing. There's no way I imagined that. It was right there. But I sighed, realizing just how tired I was, how sore my eyes were, and how desperately I needed sleep. I'll go back to the alley tomorrow. She'll turn up, I thought, trying not to think about her scared and alone, wandering the night looking for me, wondering why I hadn't found her yet. I couldn't sleep. Looking through old photos helped a little. It was nice to see her running through the fields of my old home. God, I miss it. I scrolled through every picture until I got to the most recent one, the picture of her and the other dogs. Smiling, I prepared to set it down when I noticed something strange. There was a sort of pattern to the grass. I thought I was imagining it at first, but the longer I looked, the clearer I saw it. It was like something was under the grass. The lawn seemed to bulge in lines that formed a circle around the dogs, with bits of building ground running between and around them in that circle. It was easy to write off as the natural bumpy dirt under the lawn, but something felt so deliberate about it. Have you ever seen those pictures online? The ones the artists write, the longer you look, the stranger it gets under? I felt like I was looking at one of those. Every time my eyes wandered, I noticed something else off about the picture. 2 birds in the trees I had missed before hung dead, bits of stringy rope tied around their feet to keep them suspended in the trees. The brick walls in the background seemed to have drawings carved into their surfaces. Between the dogs, half hidden in the grass, was something red and white. And finally, Shelby's eyes were a different color than their usual brown. They were yellow. A knock on the door nearly made me throw my phone. I sat up slowly. Something was weird about this knock. It sounded closer. It came again, louder this time. and I felt my body start to shake like my door had when they pounded on it. Someone was in my house and they were knocking on my bedroom door. I slowly crept out of bed, preparing to run into the bathroom and call 911 when I heard a bark from the other side of the door. I rushed to open it, stepping out into my living room and looked around. Standing in the corner of the room, obscured in shadow, was what looked like a dog. "Shelby?" I asked, voice shaking with fear.
Shelby.
It called back. Its voice was wobbly, pitched much too high, like it had to squeeze the words out. I froze in my tracks when it spoke, and could only stare in horror as it slowly stood up on its back legs and began to step towards me. It looked like something had taken my dog's skin and stretched it over its frame, but it wasn't a very good fit. Parts of its skin sag and hung low, while other parts were too tight, starting to tear and seep blood, along with thin, dangling appendages. Its mouth hung open, and it seemed like its true face was watching me from inside. Parts of its body seemed to be moving under the skin, pushing against it, trying to pry through it. It towered over me, at least 7 feet tall, lowering its face inches from mine and sniffing at me a few times. Through Shelby's ajar mouth, I could see things moving, something wet and dark that seemed to be stretching out towards me, like a hand with 100 fingers all crawling along her throat. I stepped back and slammed my bedroom door in its face, turning the lock even though it didn't sound like it was trying to get in. It just kept saying her name, over and over, as I flung open my window and crawled out. The last thing I saw before I dropped to the ground was her snout, pressing under the doorframe and sniffing for me. I'm at my friend's house now. I ran to the nearest gas station and had her come pick me up. I didn't tell her much, just that something was in my house and I needed a place to stay for the night. She was understanding and didn't try to pry. I'm typing this up on her laptop because I don't want to forget or convince myself it didn't happen. I know what I saw, and I know something took Shelby from me. And tomorrow, I'm going back to that alley to find out what.
Hey family, please be so kind as to punch the like button and smack the ass of the subscription button as well. And remember to chokehold that notification bell and then select all. That way you'll receive all notifications each time I upload a new video. And by subscribing, you'll be the first to see all of our new spooky Creepypasta stories. A very big thank you to all of the authors and narrators for being part of this awesome Halloween collaboration. Make sure to check out their Reddit profiles and YouTube channels for more brilliant stories and videos. And be sure to take a look at the Halloween playlist here for more awesome Halloween videos. I would just like to say a very big thank you to all of the authors and narrators that I have worked with, and all the ones that I will work with in the future. So thank you all, my brothers and sisters. And why not hashtag Cryptids Roost in your comments. A quick thank you to all of my Cryptids Roost community family too. We are now well on our journey to 1,000 subscribers. So please spread the word and help us to grow and expand. And don't forget to share the videos too. If you would like to throw me $1 or $3, I'd be very much appreciative. I do have PayPal, paypal.me/cryptidsroost. Alternatively, I have an account at buymeacoffee.com. You don't even need to register on either site to donate. You can also follow us at my Facebook group, Twitter and Instagram. I also have Ko-Fi, BitChute and Rumble. I have a subreddit if you have a story you would like me to narrate for you. All relevant links will be below. And don't forget to check out the end screen. See above. That will also list some more videos in my back catalogue. Take care everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful and peaceful night. And don't forget, where fear is, happiness is
Not.